Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to what if every US state became its own country. Like, America is huge. Some of its states are massive. I think Texas, I read somewhere that you can fit the UK into Texas 3 times, which is just insane. Probably a similar number with California as well. But, you know, there's some states that are tiny. I think Rhode Island is really small. I think Maine is quite small as well. So, you know, how would these new countries function? Would they be able to, you know, be self-sustaining if they were to all separate? Because I'm sure, you know, a lot of these states rely on each other for certain things. But then again, a lot of countries rely on each other for certain things, like, you know, importing food and stuff like that. So it's going to be quite interesting just to see, you know, how this plays out.
Sometimes we forget how big the US actually are, at least I do, and how large and powerful some of its states can be. Many of the states are economically powerful enough to surpass certain countries in the world, or they would be. So let's take a look at what would be the reality if each US state became independent and its own country. Now, we're going to assume that this would be viable, forget the issues of military amongst other obstacles that would effectively make this impossible to ever happen. We're also not going to take into account the fact that the US dissolving itself would not necessarily mean 50 new countries. Some others might unite into smaller unions, some could join neighboring countries like Canada or Mexico, but not for the sake of this video. What I'm going to be doing is just looking at the data of states and project how they would do as a country when compared to each other and the rest of the world. First, population. California comes at the top with 39 million, surpassing current countries like Poland or Canada, around the 33rd most
Wow, California has more people than the whole of Canada.
populous country
I did not
in
know
the
that.
world. Texas is second with 28 million. Florida with 20, New York with 19, and Pennsylvania with 12. At the bottom of the population chart, we would have Alaska with 740,000, Vermont with 620, and Wyoming with 580,000, with less population than countries like Cyprus, Comoros, or Bhutan. Next, size. Alaska would be the biggest country out of the Union, becoming the 18th largest country in the world, smaller than Libya but larger than Iran. Texas and California would follow as the second and third largest countries out of the US. At the bottom of this list would be Rhode Island, Delaware, and Connecticut. Delaware is so small that it's about the size of less than 1/5 of Estonia, and Rhode Island is smaller than the French island of Corsica. Also noteworthy that states like New York or Florida, who are prominent in the other rankings we'll see next, aren't that big, occupying the 27th and 22nd places respectively. Florida, for instance, is only a little larger than Portugal, and New York
Wow, I thought Florida, for some reason, I just always thought Florida was massive, but compared to Texas, looks like Texas is maybe 4 times the size of it.
is close to the size of Belarus, showing us that size doesn't necessarily mean more economic power. In economic terms, California would be ranking number 1. It's by far the most productive state and even self-sufficient in some aspects. And it would become the world's 5th largest economy, only behind China, Japan, Germany, and the UK. Texas wouldn't be that far behind though, also in second place as the world's 10th largest economy, between Brazil and Canada. The current economic might of the US is demonstrated by the fact that in an event like this, 4 states would be in the G20. California, Texas, New York, and Florida.
That's
kicking
crazy.
out
So even if America split up, in terms of the G20, the 20, you know, most economically powerful countries, you'd still get a lot of representation in there.
Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and South Africa, as well as the US. This economic reality is demonstrated by the GDP of each state, or each new country in this case. California would be at the top again, with a GDP of $2.7 billion. Texas with $1.7 billion, New York with $1.5, and Florida with $970 million. It seems as if, in the case of independence, these four would be at the top of almost all rankings amongst the old states. However, if we look at the GDP in another perspective,
when you divide it up by the amount of people, because California's got so many people in there.
GDP per capita, Massachusetts would have the highest one, ranking number 9 in the world, just behind the United Arab Emirates. The District of Columbia would technically be higher, but since it isn't an official state, I guess it would just be absorbed into Virginia in this scenario. This map is really interesting. It's a bit outdated from 2013, but it shows the equivalent GDP of each state to a current existing country, matching North Dakota with Uzbekistan, New Mexico with Ecuador, Connecticut to Greece, or Alaska to Luxembourg. But values have changed since then, and even these ones are a rough approximation. The end of the US would also mean that a lot of the states would have to change their state flags, most of which have something to do with the Union. Most state flags are just the state seal, and usually the seal has a lot of elements of the US, like the eagle, the order of admission into the Union, or sometimes the actual US flag. So a change would definitely be in order for those.
But you wouldn't need to, would you? You could still keep the stripes. You wouldn't absolutely have to change your flag just because the United States wouldn't exist anymore.
States like Ohio would probably want something that is more about their own identity. For instance, each state has an official bird, tree, and flower, so these could be put into use. On Ohio's case, the buckeye tree or the cardinal bird could be symbols on a new flag. I guess that in this case, states like California, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, New Jersey, or Maryland would have their problem solved, having already original flags. In the case of California or Texas, these are even flags that already represented the territories.
Wow, that one is super cool. I like that flag. Really sort of different, kind of like a artistic in a way.
At a time of independence,
California's one is cool
so
as well.
It would make even more sense to maintain them. Religion would also be an interesting topic. 14 of these new countries would be of Catholic majority. 33 would be Protestant, and 3 would be Mormon, Utah and Idaho creating the only 3 countries in the world who have a Mormon majority, along with Tonga, a small Pacific island. It's also interesting to see something else. Given that despite these differences, all states maintain a Christian majority, what would be the second largest religion in each of these new countries? The West Coast, Alaska, Hawaii, and some of the Midwest have Buddhism as their second largest religion.
Wow.
The Northeast, Judaism, and a lot of the South and Center states have Islam. Southern states are the most religious, at least in terms of attendance, so we could assume that religion would play a larger role in these future countries. States like Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire are on the opposite end, with lower church attendance and perhaps less importance of religion for the population. Assuming that military issues would not be a problem, and that the military power of the US would simply be divided among states according to the nature of each soldier, Texas would have the largest military, with a total of 292,000 troops. California would follow with a total of 247,000. And keep in mind that this data isn't really certain and might be outdated. With this data, Texas would be the 20th strongest military force in the world.
Wow.
Above
But is that based on troops or is that based on weaponry and stuff? Because, you know, if you're factoring in things like, if you divide up the amount of nukes per capita as well and the amount of, F-16s, F-22s, 35s, etc. I still think Texas would probably be a lot higher on the list because there's probably a lot of countries in the top 20 that don't have anywhere close to, maybe not even one aircraft carrier or anything like that.
Canada and California would follow right behind. However, this is just about soldiers. The question would be put of how to divide other military supplies and vehicles, like tanks, the US Navy, the Air Force. In my opinion, military unity is what makes a US breakup most unlikely. The fact that they would abdicate being the world's strongest military force, and the mere confusion and mess that it would be dealing with the post-Union military force.
Definitely.
We can also take a look at some other interesting statistics that show us current differences between states that would transfer into differences between the new countries. For instance, the legalization of marijuana, legal on all of the West Coast for recreational use, for medical use in a bunch of other states, but illegal in some others. And remember that this is before the 2018 midterm election. In terms of crime rate, should the current stats be maintained, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota would be the safest of the 50 countries. New Mexico, Alaska, Louisiana, and Arkansas would be the top 4 most dangerous countries. The states with the highest percentage of poor people could
It's crazy because Alaska's only got like, I think 700,000 people, and it's such a big state. Why is the crime so high?
Likely be in the south, while the ones with the least percentage of people in poverty would be in the northeast. Some countries would have a male population majority, like Hawaii, North Dakota, or Wyoming, and others would have a female majority, like Delaware, Alabama, Mississippi, or Maryland, amongst many other stats. The thing is, all of these statistics, despite being about specific states, are collected in the context of the Union. Should the US dissolve, all of them would probably change because the way the states are is dependent or at least related to their coexistence within the same nation.
Definitely.
For instance, California's economic might maybe would be reduced if it instantly saw its neighbors as new countries and not member states of the same union, because new trade agreements would need to be drafted, etc. And new necessities would emerge. For instance, the need of each new country to have their own military, meaning expenses in that
their own military, their own water supply, their own, power supply. Because I'm sure a lot of the energy generated by the Mississippi River is probably, used outside of Mississippi.
Amongst so many other changes that would maybe change the power relation that now exists between states. However, I think we can draw a few conclusions from all this. In the event of every state becoming independent, 4 of them would instantly become powerful countries in the world: California, Texas, New York, and Florida. They top the most significant criteria: population and economic power. However, others might also be at the top of successful countries which would emerge. Massachusetts has a solid public education and good local government using a somewhat European model in Texas, so they might be able to make it work. Other smaller states might have a more difficult time and lose a lot of their wealth as consequence of the central government not being around anymore. Maybe new unions would emerge, and we can only really try and guess what would happen.
Yeah, speculation.
If you enjoy this one,
super interesting video. Really, really interesting. Not really surprised that California would do so well, but I didn't realize just how financially and, in terms of population, how big California is. 6th biggest, it would have the 6th biggest economy in the world. Like California by itself, that's just insane. That's crazy. I didn't realize it was 40 million people who live there. That is just a huge amount of people. But yeah, like the narrator mentioned, it would be interesting to see how the military would be divided, because would it be based on the residence of each soldier? Would that be, so like if you're born in Texas, you're probably stationed at a Texas facility, so you would, remain in Texas. Is that how it would work? How would the division of aircraft and tanks be done? Would it be where each one was manufactured? Probably not, because I imagine a lot of them are manufactured at 1 or 2 plants. How would that be divvied up? That would probably be, like the narrator said, the biggest reason why such a thing would never ever happen, but still a really, really interesting thought experiment. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.